Hello and welcome everybody to Language and Education, Teaching, Learning and Assessing. Bienvenue à cette séance. On est très content de vous revoir ici et nous aurons ici un discours super chouette sur l'éducation et les langues. Just a bit of French into the air as well. So many warm welcomes to the session on Language and Education, Teaching, Learning and Assessing. And this will have our three speakers, Gabrielle Meyer, Emma Davis and Tess Fitzpatrick here today. Just to let you know that we're very keen to have input from the floor. We will be discussing the Welsh curriculum. So please, if colleagues are here who have linked to the Welsh curriculum that's going to be forthcoming, please feel free to engage in the discussion. I'm going to briefly outline the use of the social media platform for those who may not have been here this morning. I'll then introduce our three speakers and then we can go. So just for you to be aware that we have simultaneous translation today with the lovely Lindwyn Davis. And if you click on the globe at the bottom, you'll be able to move in between English and Welsh today, if you should so wish. And one of our speakers may well be presenting partly in Welsh. It would be a surprise to me, but I think they might be. There'll be the Q&A here, which you can put in for any questions as we go along. And that'll be a place for us to review all the questions that come in from the floor. You can also raise your hand to ask a question in person, should you so wish. In the chat, please do feel free to put in observations and comments as you go along, but ensure the chat is directed at all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, the chat will only come through to the panelists. It'd be really nice to have that chat available for all. So if you can, we're going to have our three speakers here today, speaking for between 10 and 12 minutes each. Please feel free to put questions into the Q&A as we go along. And our colleague Tess Fitzpatrick here may leave a little bit early, so we may begin after Tess's first talk so she can respond to any questions from the floor. So I'll now begin with an introduction to our three panellists today. Our first panelist is Professor Tess Fitzpatrick, Professor of Applied Linguistics at
Dwi'n ymwybodol bod ti wedi clicio ar gyfieithu, so just eisiau checo bod e'n gweithio.
I'm getting translation well. And Director of the Language Research Centre. Our second speaker will be Dr. Gabrielle Meyer, who's Senior Lecturer in Language Education in the Graduate School of Education at Exeter University. And our last speaker is Dr. Emma Davis, Welsh for Adults Examination Officer at the Welsh Joint Education Board, WJEC. And each will speak for around 10 to 12 minutes, followed by questions, and we'll have hopefully an open panel discussion in the last 20 minutes. So we'll begin with our colleague Tess Fitzpatrick from Swansea, who will begin the panel for us today. Over to you, Tess.
Diolch, Claire. And Prynhawn da chi gyd. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Claire, for convening this panel, and thank you all for hosting this event. I'm looking forward to hearing all the other talks, and I enjoyed the talks this morning as well. So I have some slides to share. I'll do that now. I think that should work. There we are. Claire's already introduced, hasn't she, the title of our session. So I will launch right in with my response, I suppose, to Claire's challenge of how we can motivate students to study language in the new curriculum in Wales, and indeed beyond the new curriculum for Wales as well. And I wanted to start by drawing attention to something that a lot of you will already be familiar with. The All-Party Parliamentary Group on Modern Languages reported last year, I think it was, good representation on that panel from Wales, I see, with two of our MPs there. But I think there were some interesting watchwords, really, that came out of that panel's report. First of all, they talk about a fresh mindset, and I think this fresh mindset about learning languages is possibly something that a lot of the sessions in this event will help us to move towards. And in particular, I wanted to draw out three kind of themes, I suppose, that I think, in my opinion, would be good movers and good watchwords as we take forward the new curriculum in Wales, certainly. And those are, first of all, labels like bilingualism or bilingual pupils in that case, that refer to identities. And I want to talk a little bit about how problematic perhaps such labels might be. They say that languages are perceived as difficult subjects, and I wanted to explore a little bit about that kind of perception, that attitude of difficulty. And thirdly, there's an unhappy there, which directs us to think about emotions and enjoyment, I suppose, when we're talking about language learning. A couple of years ago, I was lucky with some colleagues to have the opportunity to work on a rapid evidence assessment of effective second language teaching approaches and methods. And we reviewed about, I think it was 5,000 we started off with, papers about language learning, looking to see what the magic approach, what the magic method that none of us have come across before is. And of course, there isn't one. But some of the things that came out of that specifically were, and these won't be a surprise to people, that identity, attitude, enjoyment, or emotion at least, and motivation were more important than any single particular approach or method, that those are the things that without which the language learning is unlikely to happen in any meaningful way. And we also pulled out of that literature the fact that cross-linguistic relations and trans-languaging and things like that, I know Li Wei was talking about code switching and so on this morning, that these are key facilitators in language instruction, language education. So that I'm going to look at the first three of those, which chime with the difficulty and the emotion and the identities that I talked about earlier. And first of all, maybe think about identity and labels. And increasingly, I'm of the view that labels can be barriers as much as they are enablers. And in particular, the kinds of labels that we associate with language learning contexts, like this quote at the bottom here, whether it's monolingualism, zerolingualism, semi-bi or multilingualism, these researchers have pointed out, these are ideological constructs rather than linguistic realities. And of course, we can talk about bilingual countries. Wales is officially a bilingual country. We can talk about bilingual experiences. I think Li Wei was mentioning that this morning. But to talk about, I feel that to constrain people's identities to bilingual, multilingual, monolingual, whatever, can be seen as a barrier, especially when we're talking about trying to encourage people to learn languages. So there's another couple of fairly telling quotes there, I think, that focusing on lingualism unduly draws attention away from real people with real contexts. And discourse then regarding linguistic diversity has the effect of allowing language to take the place of people. So refocusing on people, I think, is perhaps a key message for us then. And indeed, the new curriculum in Wales does that, I think, in some interesting ways. In Wales, there's a lot of focus now on plurilingualism and on language continuum. And I think that kind of point of starting with familiarity, especially if we're talking about teaching languages in schools, familiarity, fostering curiosity, and nurturing enthusiasm is a positive, I suppose, way to go. And people familiar with the new curriculum will know that plurilingualism or plurilingual approaches is right there front and center in the introduction to our area of learning languages, literacy and communication. And there's a definition there of what plurilingualism can be conceived as. And it's about connections. It's about making connections between what we know and what we don't know yet. And it's about acknowledging that we all have varying proficiencies in our different languages and so on. So, relating to this idea of difficulty as a barrier. So that was the second thing after identities and labels, was the idea of difficulty as a potential barrier to language learning. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this Higher Education Policy Institute publication that came out earlier this year, actually. Earlier this year seems an awfully long way away, doesn't it? But it came out in January this year. And the title of that is A Languages Crisis. Megan Bowler, the author there, is actually an undergraduate student of classics herself and has some interesting perspectives. I think one of the things that she points out is this: performance measures deter schools, and this is something that a lot of us realize and acknowledge, but deter schools from entering lower attaining students for languages. And that results in subjects becoming increasingly the preserve, or perceived as the preserve, of high achievers and native speakers. And that can be damaging from the outset to people who don't perceive themselves as high achievers in academia. In terms of difficulty as a barrier, also, it reminded me, reading that work of Megan Bowler's, with some colleagues, we have just completed a project to create a national corpus of contemporary Welsh. And one of the kind of underlying principles of that project is that it was a community affair. And we gathered an awful lot of data from community users of Welsh. But we came across an unexpected barrier there too, which was that when we were collecting this corpus data, our research assistants observed that very often they were confronted with somebody saying, I can't possibly contribute to your corpus because my Welsh isn't good enough. And these were people who one would identify and identified themselves as Welsh speakers, but that idea of my Welsh isn't good enough is all part to me of this kind of packaging of language use as well as language learning as something difficult, which can be a barrier. Recently, there's been quite a lot of publications around a new kind of approach to difficulty or a new conceptualization of difficulty, which is called grit. And there's some of the publications that have come out talking about this idea of grit, which is seen as a combination of perseverance of effort and consistency of interest, which is what is recognized, I imagine, by the whole of the audience here as something which is necessary for meaningful language learning to take place. But this idea of grit is quite compelling. And one of the authors of these studies says a salient characteristic of grit is its malleability. And that's quite empowering for language teachers, because if the grit is malleable, it means that in the L2 classroom, L2 teachers can use it as a strong tool to prepare students for what the challenge of L2 learning actually is. So I was quite taken with that idea of grit as perhaps a more positive spin on difficultness of learning languages. And then the last of the three things that I identified was to do with emotion. And emotion can be conceptualized in a couple of, or is conceptualized in a couple of very strong ways in language learning, I think. One is anxiety, learning anxiety, which we are familiar with as learners ourselves and as teachers and researchers. But anxiety as a barrier is seen in publications such as this. And I'm going to focus on the enjoyment in a moment. But for the anxiety, Diwali and McIntyre say that SLA researchers have mostly focused, in their view, on the negative face of emotion, with anxiety being the most studied topic, and language anxiety they conceptualize as the worrying and negative emotional reaction to do with learning or using a second language. But this paper in particular talks about the two faces of language learning, and the other face being joy, being enjoyment of language learning. And this, again, is quite a recent focus, I would say, in second language acquisition research, and might contribute to that fresh mindset. So quite often, enjoyment and anxiety are kind of weighed up against each other, as in some of these publications, the right and left feet of the language learner we see here. And if you focus on the enjoyment or enjoyableness, it seemed to enhance the effectiveness on the one hand, and the belief that something is effective makes it seem more enjoyable on the other hand. So there's kind of a virtuous circle going on here, perhaps, in terms of that emotional response to language learning. And I thought you might enjoy, just as I kind of draw to a close in a minute, you might enjoy the taxonomy, if you like, of things that these kinds of researchers into language anxiety, and in this case enjoyment, ask. And they ask students to, in their studies, their experiments, they ask students to tick these kinds of things in order to assess, there are others on the scale as well, but in order to assess how much joy there is in a particular language classroom. And I think, like these authors do, like Green and Diwali and McIntyre do, I think sometimes there's perhaps too much focus on the stress and the difficulty and the anxiety, and perhaps focusing on these kinds of things might be a good kind of way to swim our way through the new curriculum. So we've got creativity there. There's laughter a lot there. Avoiding boredom. feeling like a worthy member of the class, whatever your level of proficiency is, you're a worthy member of the class. It's things to do with being interested and positive. Foreign languages are cool. And I like those last three, the friendliness, fun, and laughing a lot as keys to the foreign language classroom. So I would say to conclude then that for me, having read the research that I have and having been a language learner and been a language teacher as well, I quite liked these watchwords for the fresh mindset. Plurilingualism, which I think in the new Welsh curriculum, we've got fantastic opportunities to explore and really to extend. And the grit and the joy of language learning and to focus on those perhaps rather than perceptions of difficulty and anxiety. So I will stop sharing my slides there. I think that was a reasonably close to 10-minute whistle-stop tour there, Claire. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tess. And I couldn't agree more on the need for us to look at the creativity and the fun. And you're absolutely right, a more I suppose, capacious understanding of what language learning brings the individual, rather away from the anxiety around understandable, anxiety for learners in a classroom, particularly teenagers as well. Thank you very much, Tess. I don't have any questions as yet in the Q&A, Tess, directly to you. And I know that you're not able to stay for the whole session. So if colleagues do have questions for Tess or any observations, they could put those into the chat or the Q&A. We'll try and pick those up. And hopefully, Tess, we may have some time before you need to depart. But if colleagues have particular questions, it would be a good opportunity to make those now, or put them in the chat and Tess can respond back in the chat if that's okay, Tess. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we'll move on now to our colleague, Dr. Emyr Davies, who's going to be presenting now, particularly with his expertise around Welsh for adults. So I'll hand over to Emyr.
Iawn, prynawn da I chi gyd.
Yes, thank you, and good afternoon to you all.
Diolch yn fawr am y gwahoddiad I fod yn rhan.
I'd like to thank you for the invitation to be part of today's panel. I feel rather unqualified, actually, to be a member of this panel.
Dwi'n gweithio I Cybac, sef prif darparwr cyweisterau I sector ysgolion yng Nghymru.
And I work for the sector of Welsh for adults. That's the sector that I'm familiar with. And as it happens, I've been working in this field and in this sector for exactly 30 years. I began in Trinity College in Carmarthen in 1990, teaching Welsh on all sorts of courses at all levels. And then I spent 11 years then. Since 2001, I have been responsible for assessing and responsible for developing a series of examinations for Welsh for adults. So I've seen these developments from the fringes, as it were.
Cwricwlwm I Gymru, ac mae'r un peth yn wir am gymwysterau i'r sector ysgolion. Felly dyna fi, fel mae gwleidyddion ein hoes ni yn osgoi ateb y cwestiwn a osodwyd gan Claire yn llwyr. Ac yn nodi wrth fynd heibo hefyd, nad ydw i'n mynegu safbwynt neb arall fan hyn. Ond mae 30 mlynedd yn rhyw fath o garreg filltir ac yn gyfle I gnoi cil ychydig. A'r gwahaniaeth mawr rhwng fy mhrofiad I a'r profiad athrawon ysgol yw'r bod yr oedolion dwi wedi dysgu yn dewis bod yno. Dwi erioed wedi gorfod wynebu dosbarth o ddisgyblion sydd ddim eisiau dysgu Cymraeg, sydd ddim eisiau dysgu dim byd. Prin iawn yw'r rhai hynny o ddim eisiau bod yna. A mae'r un peth yn wir am y 1,600...
Sorry, Emyr, we went through getting a problem. Mae'n problem gyda'r cyfieithu ar hyn y bryd.
Sy'n sefyll ar aroliadau dwi'n gyfrifol amdano. A mae hyn yn fraint, wrth gwrs. Dwi ddim yn gwarantu bod yr oedolion yn ddysgwyr gwell, ond o leia mae'r cam allweddol cyntaf hwnnw wedi gymryd. Chydig eiliad.
Emyr, mae yna broblem ar hyn o bryd gyda'r cyfieithu.
Edrych ar y cwestiynau nawr. Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. Is everything okay, Claire? I had Mererid on the phone just now. Just to check.
I think that the Welsh translation appeared to have been disabled, Emir, so I don't know whether you had inadvertently pressed anything.
Okay. I can carry on.
Can we pause for a couple of minutes while I double check with Linwen that it's working again?
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah. It's Linwen here, the interpreter speaking. I haven't been assigned as an interpreter. So each time a new interpreter comes in, they have to be assigned as the interpreter. And that still hasn't happened. You need to go to your interpretation on the Dropbox, begin typing my email in, and then assign interpreter, and then I can click on my screen. So you, if you would require translation.
Please start so we can have a go. It will now say English or Chinese. If you need translation into English, please select English.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I'll wait for that.
So I'll speak for a while now, and hopefully Linwen will be with me. And if Claire can perhaps give a thumbs up to say that it's working and that everything's all fine, I'll make a start. So the first thing I've said is very similar to what I said 5 minutes ago. But as I've mentioned, I do feel rather unqualified to be on this panel. I work for the WJAC, and who is the main provider of qualifications for the education sector in England and Wales, as we also provide in England. But I work specifically in the field of Welsh for adults. And I've been working in this sector for 30 years. I began in Trinity College, Carmarthen, in 1990, teaching on Welsh courses of all kinds at all levels. And I was there for some 11 years before I moved to work in the field of assessment. And I've been working in that field now since 2001. So I'm only seeing the developments from the fringes, as it were, when it comes to some of the other sectors. And the same is true of qualifications for schools. So as a good politician, I've now tried to avoid the question. 30 years, I'm sure, is some sort of a milestone and an opportunity to look back and reflect at the differences between my experience and the experience of teachers, because teachers are the adults then choose to be there. I haven't had to face a class full of children or children in their teenagers who don't necessarily want to learn a language. Those who have sat in front of me as a class, very few of those don't actually want to learn. And it's certainly an honour and a privilege, of course, to teach these people.
Just a quick synopsis as I go along.
And Mererid has asked me to give you a synopsis, because I've been in this sector for some 30 years, which is quite scary.
And the main difference from my experience to the experience of many teachers, I guess, is that the people in my classes want to be there, have chosen to be there. And the candidates for my exams, the exams that I'm responsible for, have chosen to take the exams as well. Iawn. Mae Tess wedi sôn am...
Well, Tess has already spoken about the value of multilingualism and plurilingualism, a new term, and we've known this for many years. I remember being in a conference in Carmarthen a few years ago, listening to Professor Jim Cummins describing the tsunami of evidence about the advantages of bilingualism and multilingualism. However, this presumption that the monolingual society is the norm, and for decades in the 20th century in Wales, and prior to that, of course, there were educators and authors of papers would publish studies that would claim that bilingualism was harmful to children and actually was harmful to children's development and education. Books such as The Bilingual Problem that was published in 1924. And so this planted those negative attitudes towards the Welsh language and Welsh medium education, and that was far-reaching. Parents then chose not to speak Welsh with their children, let alone choosing Welsh medium education.
Throughout the 20th century, a preconceived notion that bilingualism was a handicap and a problem. The publication I put up there is a cover of a report published in 1924 stating the bilingual problem, which then engendered these negative attitudes towards the Welsh language and towards Welsh education. Ond erbyn hyn, dyn ni'n gwybod.
But we now know that the opposite is true. As David Crystal mentioned in 2006, that being bilingualism is the norm. That's how 3/4 of the population of the world live. And we need to re-establish that idea and concept and to implement it. Because, as Crystal states, in the modern world, monolingualism is not a strength, but a handicap, which is totally different to what was stated a century before. Yes, it is difficult to turn abstract academic evidence into practical persuasion. Yes, we do have the evidence, but it can be difficult to use the arguments about the cognitive advantages, etc., when persuading people to join a class or to choose a language class. And similar to teaching modern foreign languages in our schools, apparently, the first task for us in this field is to attract people and get them through the door, to get them through the Welsh door, if you wish.
Just to say, we have the academic and abstract arguments in favour of plurilingualism. But as proponents of language courses, we need to sell our courses and to persuade people of the value of joining a Welsh course, or if they're in school, to choose a modern languages course.
When I was working as a tutor and organiser in Carmarthen in the 90s, I would do anything to sell the courses. I would take stalls to the market in the middle of town. I would try and target parents through schools and nurseries in order to get the parents to join. And the positive would normally be positive, not every time. And I do remember one lady in Carmarthen Market telling me once on a Saturday morning, she said quite angrily actually, she wasn't very happy, and she said, right, she told me to go away because Carmarthen has been English speaking since Roman times. And I didn't have the heart to tell her that English didn't even exist during Roman times. It's fine talking about identity, and I think that's important. and this key to culture, and that it's offering a window to the world, etc., etc. All of these are valuable, but we have to use more material marketing arguments in order to try and attract people to attend Welsh courses, or also to attend modern foreign languages courses in schools as well. We know that the statistics with regards to learning modern languages are on a downwards trend, but a recent report, which you will see on this screen, refers to that, and that's between 2019 and 2020, where there was a decrease of 10% in the numbers studying GCSE, and also a decrease of 16% studying at A level.
A report by the British Council, it's only just come out, refers to the drop in of take-up in modern languages at GCSE and at A level. Again, it doesn't make even make the headlines nowadays like it used to. Mae ffactorau gwahanol ar waith.
There are different factors at work, and there are no easy answers. As Tess mentioned a little bit earlier, one of the factors that the subject is seen as being difficult and challenging, and that you need grit in order to continue on a course. Well, there's no escape from that. Learning Welsh is challenging, and it does take time, and you do need grit to do it. One of the suggestions in this report, the language trends, is that we should turn our sights towards the European framework, the Common European Framework for Languages.
One of the suggestions given in the British Council report is that developers of the curriculum for Wales should turn to the Common European Framework to inform their work in developing the new curriculum. Dwi ddim yn mynd I siarad mwy.
I won't say any more. I won't say too much about the CEFR, this framework for languages. But you can see that there's a store of information about this framework, and also the new companion volume that goes with this. That's on the European website. And it is certainly worth noting that we need to look at that store of resources and the companion value, and that talks about the skills that we've already mentioned here in Wales, which is mediation, but also it's referred to as translanguaging. And it also refers to recognizing that we as educators and assessors need to acknowledge the existence of the relationship between languages and the relationships between all of these languages. Well, I'm glad to be able to say that we in the field of Welsh for adults have done quite a lot of work in making our examinations relevant to our courses and to make it a common examination to this framework, and that we can say with some confidence now that our qualifications on an A1 and an AB2 level, which gives some confidence to learners who sit these examinations. I accept, and I know what may be going through your minds at the moment, not every Welsh learner wishes to sit an examination, of course. And that's totally acceptable. But how can we then attract people to our work, to learning Welsh? What is the tip then? And Claire asked me to talk about advice that I would perhaps give, and there's no one answer. Different things will inspire our learners and the different learners. Some are inspired by music, history, culture, and some are even inspired by poetry.
One of the questions Claire asked was to give one piece of advice to learners, one tip for people who are thinking of joining a course. And okay, not one thing will attract all learners. Some are going to be drawn by music, culture, a different history. Some even by such esoteric things as poetry. This is incredible. But quite often, the first prompt, the first netting, as it were, of people to come towards the language is something that happens by chance. I was born in Berniadi.
I was actually adjudicating a competition, the Learner of the Year competition. And I remember one learner telling me that he was quite shocked after getting to the university where they were studying. Not necessarily that he was seeing Welsh, but that the majority of his lecturers, the technical staff, and cleaners in the university spoke Welsh. And that was an enormous shock to him. So being visible as well as being heard is extremely important. And that's why it's key that officers, politicians use their Welsh publicly.
Just to summarize that small point, adjudicating the Welsh Learner of the Year competition, one of the candidates there, on arriving at the university, was just shocked to find that the members of his department, I think it was the physics department, most spoke Welsh. The staff, the technical staff spoke Welsh. The cleaners all spoke Welsh. And it was such an audible shock to him that he became fluent by the time he graduated. Okay, so just I gloi felly.
And so to close, if I have to give one piece of advice for Welsh learners, and I'm sure that you'd expect me to say this, but to sit an examination would be the answer that I would give you, if that's what you want to do. We have plenty of evidence that sitting an examination, on whichever level, will improve motivation and interest. And it's one of the things that candidates will say when responding to, they have an opportunity to give feedback following an examination. Talking about a career or a workplace, that doesn't count as much as being in motivation to give them a kick, if you wish, to learn at the end of a year's course. So sitting an examination is not a waste of time if that examination is relevant to the syllabus and the skills and the knowledge that is nurtured in the courses. And perhaps more important than anything else is relevant to the skills and the information that they need in the real world. One of the most encouraging comments that remains in my mind from one of the candidates was this. This is one of the comments in the feedback. The Welsh people I meet are even more helpful when they know you're serious. I.e., formal examinations, whether you like them or not, shows that the learner is serious, and it shows that we as a field of Welsh for adults are also serious about what we do. If we make qualifications essential for various posts, that is a political question, I know. And if I can quote, just to finish, a piece of poetry. Looking at the qualifications can be like looking at an ornament on a seld. But it is essential if we want to see things happening.
You can praise this object of beauty as much as you want, but make her compulsory, then you'll see. That's when trouble starts. Do we need to make qualifications essential, like many others have done in other places? Oes angen I ni ddilyn esiampl?
Do we need to follow the example of Catalonia and the Basque Country and to make Welsh qualifications compulsory? Well, I don't know whether that will succeed, but I'm more of an optimist than many. I wonder whether this will contribute to the million of Welsh speakers which we will have in 30 years' time. Only time will tell.
Iawn. Diolch yn fawr i'r cyfieithu. Thank you very much to the translator. Sorry about the problems that we've had.
Thank you very much, Emir. That showed grit. That showed perseverance, grit and resilience. And that's what we want in a multilingual world. I'm very well aware that Tess may have to leave us very soon. So would anybody like to pose a question to Tess before she has to leave, either in the Q&A or in the chat? Because I know that she will be leaving us in the next 4 or 5 minutes. Have you got any questions? Now is your moment to put a question into the Q&A or the chat, and Tess, I think, will be very happy to respond. Or maybe you're thinking things through in the audience today and thinking about things in it. And again, I'm sure if colleagues had questions for Tess, we'll put Tess's maybe email in the chat. Tess, if you mind putting your email in the chat, Tess, then people will be able to send you questions should they wish to outside this session today.
I'll do that now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tess. Okay, so we'll move on to our final speaker today, which is Gabriela Maya. And Gabby will be talking now for another 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have an open panel with herself, Emir, and myself. So over to you, Gabriela.
Okay, can you see my PowerPoint now? Excellent, thank you very much. So I'm going to move to full screen. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation above all. Thanks also for the organisers and obviously for the translation of this talk. Thank you very much. So I found this very interesting to listen to Tess and Emir today. Unfortunately, I couldn't listen to earlier contributions because I was in another conference somewhere in virtual Paris. But now I would like to talk about basically, I would like to take up what Tess said, that we should refocus on the people in the learning. And we are learning whatever language it is in a political environment. And I think Emil has described this very well for the Welsh context. We're also learning it in a classroom, but we're also learning it outside the class. We're using the language because learning languages alone is not the end. The end is obviously to use them for social contacts, for work, etc. So we need to bring all these fields together. And I would like to just start with a quick question to the audience. Really, I don't know how many people we have in the audience today, but I would like to ask you, when you think of your own language learning, what languages have you been exposed to in the past? What languages are important for you now as you're working, studying, socializing, whatever you're doing in this phase of your life? And what languages do you envisage in the future? What languages would you like to learn? What languages would you like to improve in the future? Would you like to expand your linguistic repertoire or add to your plurilingualism? This was the term that was used today. So it's not only what we personally want to do, but obviously we also hear languages around us. How do we feel about those? What do they mean to us? Are they important to us? Are they a problem? What languages do we see? And I think this was a very nice example of Emir to say, well, all of a sudden I realized everybody was speaking Welsh around me. And this was quite shocking. Maybe there are other situations where we notice languages, maybe not as a shock, but maybe as a matter of interest or something else. So think about, how do you sit in the world with all these languages around you? And in Wales, obviously, there is the particular situation of having Welsh and English alongside one another, plus the huge amount of languages that tourists bring in, business people bring in, that workers or people who come to live in Wales from other areas of the world come. So there is a whole spectrum and a whole prism of languages, if you want. Okay. So just to illustrate a little bit, this is as an introduction to myself. I was born in Switzerland in this little smiley here, growing up as a Swiss German speaker. And I lived in various places, lived and studied in various places of Europe, everywhere where there is a smiley. I spent some longer time, and everywhere I was exposed to languages, of course. And languages were evaluated in different ways. People thought differently about languages. For example, in Switzerland, I was expected to learn languages. There was nobody said it's difficult. Maths is also difficult. Learning to read and write in standard German is also difficult. Driving a car is also quite difficult, but nobody said, well, that's too difficult. It was just something that is expected. And I think this is where we come back to the mindset that both Emir and Tess have mentioned. What are our expectations of the people around us in our societies? And so I grew up with understanding my grandmother's both had hardly any education, but they both learned French because that was expected from a girl growing up. My parents then, they also were expected to learn English because that's the global language, as well as French because that was the language that is needed to operate as a Swiss or to be a good Swiss. We needed both languages, even though in our everyday languages, in everyday life, I didn't need French at all. But so I sort of used other languages. But one episode from my very first language learning experience I would like to share with you. I've got a family in the Italian part down here. And we were on holiday here, and I was 4 years old. And my parents said, why don't you go and get the bread rolls for this morning? You just need to go into the shop. Here is the money, and say, 5 panini per favore. And so I went and came out with huge pride that I actually bought some rolls in a foreign language, in a region I had no idea. The secret language opened the doors for us, and we had breakfast on the table at the same time. And I found that hugely motivating. This experience stayed with me all my life and got me into a career with languages, to be honest. This gave me the belief in myself that I am a language learner, that you can get things done in the real life with languages. It was a really tactile and experience. Later on, I learned French in school. That was my first other language, additional language, besides standard German, because I grew up with my dialect. And then I thought, I'd better go to the French part like we do and improve my French. So I found myself a job in France, in the French part, in Lausanne. And there I thought, I can use now my language, my French, which was quite good. And for work, it was worked very well. But I found it really difficult to make contact with local people. I experienced some, what people might call discrimination. There is some antipathy against German speakers. We are the majority. We are politically more powerful. More money maybe is in the German part. So there is a political dimension to that. But people really, as soon as I started speaking French and people were aware of my accent, they didn't want to speak to me anymore. And so I spoke to people who spoke French as a second language as well. This is just to show two experiences that I had, that where my belief got a little bit crushed, that even if I'm good at this language, I was motivated, there was no question about that, but it didn't quite work to make that, it didn't quite make it work in society for me. So these are just a couple of examples. So, and this is basically, I want to sort of use the lens of language socialization. So what languages are we exposed to? What do they mean? Where do we use them in this talk? So when we go on, we use languages in different domains. with friends, in the media, internet, school, etc. And languages have different values. And certain things are normal. So this again takes us to our mindset. What is expected? Which languages can I bring into school and which ones do I have to leave at home? So it's that kind of thing. So we have lots of languages around us, and in certain areas, one is foregrounded or two are foregrounded, and other ones have to go maybe in the background, which is kind of a normal thing. But so this basically leads me to use the theoretical terms a little bit more, because this is related to three main areas. And one of them, especially identities, has been talked about all morning, I think, already to a great extent. But it's also related to norms. And with norms, we mean mindsets. What kind of mindsets are there? For example, who is expected to have what language resources? Can we use the languages from our past, or do we now need to forget them or change them? Do we need to, what do the language resources that we use every day mean, or do we want other ones in the future? What are the languages that are necessary or labeled as well, maybe as necessary, useful, or as a problem? Are there any? Or for what? Whose job is language learning and teaching? Is it education? Is it the family education, or is it the wider society? And for me, it was definitely all three. The family was very, very important for me because they made me believe in myself as a language learner. My parents, my family, they also speakers of other languages, so they gave me the expectation that is normal. When I grow up, I will be able to use other languages. That was my expectations, and you have to do what you have to do to get there somehow. But also I was very privileged in my life to be able to live in different parts of the world and to experience what it means to be a language learner, to learn new languages and to make new friendships, to make new lives, to get married, to live in the UK and so on and so forth, to find work and opportunities in other areas. And I think this motivation happens at all these different stages in different domains, because obviously music, for example, like Emir said, we find our spheres of interest, be that music or poetry or sports or clubs or films, and this is all part of where we can also access languages. And this brings me kind of to the domain and where can we practice these languages. And I think as educators and as learners, we really need to be creative about thinking where and how can we use the languages in the real life. Because I have this one episode, another anecdote I would like to share with you. A friend of mine with an Irish background, but she grew up in England most of her life and then moved to Wales. And she thought, I'm in Wales now. Obviously, I need to go to a class that Emir teaches and learn Welsh. She did that for 5 years. And I think she can hold the conversation together. You know, she's getting somewhere because she also studied other languages earlier in her life, which gave her the belief that she can do it. And I said, what about your Welsh? And she said, I'm not studying anymore. And then I said, why not? Well, I have so few opportunities to use it. I have friends who are native Welsh speakers and who are learning Welsh as well, but it's always so hard to have a conversation and everybody speaks English. And so therefore, you know, I lost interest. And I think this is another point where we really have to think carefully, not just for the Welsh speakers, but also for our learners of English as another language in the classrooms, in our society. How can we make our environment one that has high expectations, which values diverse languages? Obviously, there are languages that are more important to get on in life, to participate, but which also respect and support past, present, and future language identities, imagined identities, visions of identity. Where would I like to go? And these are basically my tips for motivation in a way, and generate real-life opportunities. And these real-life opportunities obviously can also happen in a school environment, for example, through content-led language learning, where we use maybe, I've done a lot of research into bilingual education, for example, in Berlin and Hamburg, also in London, where they use locally spoken languages to teach. So they use two languages to teach, one language to teach half of the curriculum and another language to teach another half of the curriculum, so that people in each lesson are, well, in one lesson there would be a language learner, and in the other one there would be a language expert helping the others who are learning. So this would create real-life opportunities. This is obviously just one way. You can do this in a classroom as well, but I think it also, in Wales particularly, or in parts of Wales, it may not be the same everywhere, of course. I'm living outside of Wales, I have to say, but there seems to be a mindset that language, there seems to be a need for a mindset that language learning, including Welsh, is an activity for the whole society and not something only for schools. So I think I will stop here and just thank you very much, Diolch and fawr, as also to the translator, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriel. That was super. And thank you very much to yourself and Emir for making such wonderful connections across all of our three speakers. So I think we're going to begin, colleagues, by looking at the questions in the Q&A. And there was also a question from Newydd, obviously our host for the session as well. So Newydd, I'll put you as our fourth intervention because you have privileged status across the conference. I'll begin with our questions in the Q&A. I very kindly had support from a fab translator to translate the first question, which is aimed at Emir, which is, Emir, what happens after passing the examinations that you've mentioned? What would be the advice for someone who has done the examination, but who then loses the impetus to continue learning because of a lack of further milestones? So the link between, I suppose, extrinsic and intrinsic motivation linked to examinations. If I could ask you maybe to address that one first.
Yn Gymraeg?
Yes, so I'll answer in Welsh. Yes, thank you for the question. So what happens after the examinations? The first answer would be to do another examination. You do have a series of examinations that can be used as steps on the ladder, if you wish. I don't particularly like that image, but we know from the feedback that comes back from candidates, for those who are at a B1 and B2 level, have already more or less all of them have sat the examinations at a lower level. So people do use them as a motivation and an increasing motivation along their pathway when learning Welsh. One element that also adds to that social element, if you wish, as you go on to the levels, one of the tasks in B1 and B2 being recording a conversation with a fluent speaker. The candidate then has to lead that conversation. One of the reasons why that task is there is to show the interactive skills and task and to force them to use the Welsh language outside of the class and outside of the context of an examination. The title of this series of examinations is Use of Welsh. Perhaps a more difficult question then is, if they fail, do they lose confidence? Do they lose motivation? I'm sure that there are examples of that happening, but I would argue that the candidates who sit these examinations are not sitting them unless they are ready and willing to fail. They choose to sit the examination. and they are confident that they will be successful. And tutors are certainly probably encourage them to sit the examination, and they normally do succeed. And the grades are quite high. I think it's the success rates is about 90% and above for those various levels. It does vary somewhat. So very few actually fail. And I am going to say something contentious here. So is our attitude towards failure different than to attitudes of our friends in Europe? Because I do think it is different. In this country, it's seen as something harmful to someone's psychology, almost a tragedy if somebody fails an examination. In other countries, and from my experience, and I know everyone speaks from their individual and personal experience, it doesn't necessarily happen to that extent in other countries. People just say, right, okay, I failed this and I'll try again. I remember speaking to friends or people doing similar work to me in the Basque Country. So many more do the eager examination in the Basque Country. I remember Gemma saying at one time, we only had 15,000 candidates this year. It's a very bad year. How many people pass? On average, in a year, it varies, I think, but some 30%, I think, actually pass the examination. And it's not seen as something that's harmful to the individual learner. But the context there I know is different. And I am fortunate because people I teach choose to sit the examination.
Well, thank you very much for that one, Emir. And I think we'll come on to that in a subsequent question around the link between examination and assessment. But I wanted to go on to the next question in our Q&A, which was one I think aimed at Tess, who's not here, but maybe I can provide some response. Plus, I know we have our colleague Anna Vivian Jones amongst the attendees who has worked on the new curriculum for Wales, and Anna might be prepared to intervene if I could unmute her. And the question is, for Tess or for colleagues who are engaged, what might be the impact of introducing international languages into progression step 1 in the new Welsh curriculum in what matters instead of progression step 2? And that kind of would mean very young children, 3 to 8 or 9, rather than 10 or 11. What would be a strategy for so doing? So in other words, the new curriculum is going to require primary schools to introduce a language in year 5, which is students of 10 or 11, rather than beginning at the very early stage where Welsh and English are both introduced. And the question is, what would be the impact, or what could be the impact, if the new curriculum for Wales were to introduce an international language at an earlier stage? I don't know if Anna Vivian Jones would be prepared to comment on this as a colleague who's been involved in the new curriculum's development. I can certainly comment as a colleague who's been involved in developing international language in the curriculum, is that we would have been, those of us who mobilised around modern languages would have been very keen on an earlier introduction, but we're very well aware about some of the challenges that face, to some extent, retooling, reskilling a very large grouping of teachers to introduce at an earlier stage modern foreign languages. But we were very, very keen to have a very full, what we call language continuum. I think Anna's here, so maybe if I can unmute Anna, if she'd be prepared maybe to say a few words about the new curriculum and its approach to international languages.
Diolch yn fawr, Claire. Yes, not that I want to
Claire.
My session tomorrow on the panel at all and give away any surprises. No, there wasn't. The progression steps are just a guide. We recommend that teachers know what the language or the linguistic landscape of their school is, that they can identify what the language needs of their own learners are. And therefore, the progression steps are a guide and show what progression looks like along the continuum of language learning rather than age specific. So the progression steps have been from the outset stage rather than age specific. And therefore it would be up to a school to decide really when it would be most suitable for that third language to be introduced. And for us to be aware also that introducing a third language in Welsh schools is introducing a third language to an already bilingual context. And the aim and the vision of the AOLE is that by learning more about the way languages work, beginning with the languages that learners are already learning at school, will enable them easier then to turn to the learning of a third language, transferring knowledge, skills, and understanding to all subsequent languages. But of course, one main reason why it's a third language is that we have a bilingual context in Wales, and therefore the introduction of Welsh to both Welsh medium and English medium context, and securing that language in the continuum of language learning for that learner was of the utmost importance.
Thank you, Anna. I know that you're not on the panel, Anna, but would you mind just holding on? Because actually, we've got another question I want to ask Gabby to respond to, but I think it would also be very relevant to your expertise. And Anna was very integral to the development of the AOLE, the Area of Learning and Experience, which in the new curriculum would be called Languages, Literacy and Communication. And Anna was very involved as a modern foreign language expert, but also obviously as a Welsh language expert as well. So this is why I invited her into our door, because she's a colleague who's both a practitioner, a developer and a trainer, but also who's also been involved in the strategy behind the curriculum. And the question I wanted to take us to, maybe if you wouldn't mind first, Gabby, is a question from Jessica, and I think that Anna can come into, is how can we develop being curious about language, what we're calling meta-linguistic awareness, and how language works in dual language classrooms? Jessica's asking, how can we motivate and enthuse that curiosity, that meta-linguistic awareness in a bilingual classroom? So I don't know if you want to maybe respond first, Gabby, and then I might turn to Anna if she has any insights as well.
Sorry, thank you for the question. There is I've done a little bit of work on this, really, on this curiosity, on stimulating motivation, and this is based on again language socialization. We have thought that there is a way where there are basically again domains in a school, in education, where languages can be activated or made visible, recognized, respected, and so on. One would be to create a multilingual environment. And this is kind of what we have here. It is, we hear Welsh and English at least, and we know that other languages are present as well. We heard Claire speak French. We don't necessarily know all these languages, but they are there and they are normal. They're part of our world. And that gives us also the idea that maybe at some stage we want to engage with them more closely, but it also respects and recognizes the knowledge that people already have and bring in. So this could be in assemblies, they could be bilingual. It is, and I think that this is happening all over the country, everywhere. There is bilingual visuals, posters, school children's or learners' work, etc., as well as film screenings in this or the other language. So that's a kind of environment. But then maybe also have specific sessions on language awareness. So like I asked you at the beginning, sort of to just activate your knowledge about the past, the present, and the future. That's a very simple way just to think about what languages are there in your life? What other languages might there be? What have they meant to you at different stages in your life? What experiences have you had with those? And there is a tool that we developed at the University of Exeter to develop ideas. It's a teacher-educator tool that can be used. I can put this in the chat in a minute. The link to it, it's free and everybody can use it. It's not particularly for Welsh or for anything. It's just to think about languages in any educational environment. Then we could think about when we teach grammar, for example, do we draw on the knowledge that people have already? For example, and I'm sure this is something that Emir, you have been thinking about as well. it's when, for example, I've been talking about how can we teach, students have asked me, how can we teach the passive voice in Saudi Arabia? And then we sort of, they did a bit of discovery and found out that actually the passive voice in Arabic is the same as in English. The syntax is the same. And so they thought, oh, wow, this is really interesting. What about the other things? And so they became really curious about the links between the language they were learning and the language that they knew already, and they had already an idea about their grammar. Others then said, oh, I didn't really know that this was the grammar in my language was like this, but now I understand, oh, this is so exciting. And I think this is also what got me so interested, even though the teachers have not often asked me to make this comparison between the languages I was learning, not just my first language and my second language, but at the same time I was learning French and English. We could have made connections there because I had already quite a good understanding of French. And a lot of the French words, they're basically also English words, but they don't always translate one-to-one. So that kind of language awareness could then also work. And obviously also assessment, but not necessarily only formal assessment through exams, but also recognizing, oh, wow, you can speak this language, and you can understand this. You may not be able to write it, but it's something to celebrate. So we can celebrate all the language knowledge rather than just the one that is relevant in our classroom here. And I was at the NALDIC conference at the Subject Association for English as an Additional Language on Saturday. And there also people talked about this mindset a lot and about how can we make this work in a classroom. And where am I going with this? I think I lost my thread a little bit. But it is about making this awareness where we can also have a conversation about language like we are doing here now without actually knowing all the languages, but we can still have, so in a class, a Welsh class, for example, you could still talk about, and you probably do as well, about, well, what is Arabic like and what is this language like, and, you know, what other languages and expertise have you got? So to stimulate this curiosity and to get more curious as we go along. Sorry if this has been a bit of a long answer.
No, Gabby, that's lovely. And I know that Anna will want to come in here because Anna's been working very much with what we're calling here multilingual literacy as well.
Yeah.
To draw on that. I don't know if Anna would like to talk about this because I know that for the curriculum for Wales, this pluralistic model of language development is absolutely core to the mindset and the teaching pedagogy that I know that Anna and colleagues are developing. So I don't know if you want to come in here, Anna, and talk about the curriculum in particular as a really, I think, interesting example for the colleagues in the panel and obviously our delegates.
Yes, and I wanted to say also, of course, that as a team who was working on the new curriculum, we were very, very fortunate and privileged to have worked with language experts in Wales, Mirerid, Claire, Entley, and using the research produced by Tess and also by Gabriella. So that fed into our thinking as the curriculum was being developed. And we learn a lot from what pupils tell us. There was a very revealing response in one reflecting about language session that I did with learners in an English medium context. It was a girl from Sri Lanka who said, it's by learning Welsh and Spanish at school that I understand my own language better, even though there is nothing similar between them. And I think that this is the curiosity that we really want to engender. And I talked to Claire about how do we create a multilingual ethos in our classrooms. And it's not only about acknowledging the existence of more than one language or even celebrating it, but the curriculum for Wales is actually asking us to show progress in understanding about multiple languages, progress in the skill of translanguaging and mediation. And therefore, there are challenges ahead for us as teachers. Professional learning and support from yourselves will be necessary and required so that we can enable our learners to fulfill these aspirations that we have for them for future language learning.
And can I come in there, maybe bring together your comments there? And also, we've had a couple of comments, one from Meredith herself, who wanted to ask Emir about the link between assessment and examinations. And also a colleague has also put into the chat, here's what I'm translating with support from Griff, our lovely colleague here. The question was, do you need an examination, another piece of paper, to show your language ability, whether in Welsh or another language? I do want to ask all four panelists, or three panelists here today, including Anna, I'm really intrigued by the link, the not link, the connection between formal assessment and language evaluation. And I think that the new curriculum will be offering a more, again, pluralistic model there. Emir has very strongly made the case for an examination, a formal examination, to be a pivotal jump point and motivation. Emir, I've got to be honest, I'm less convinced by that than you might be, but I'd be very keen to know what colleagues think about the link and what should the link be between the learning and the assessment. And it may not always be an examination, but how do we conceptualize that to really maintain progression, as the colleagues said here in their question, to try and recognize language ability and to motivate further. So maybe if I go first to you, because I've been a little bit contestatory here, contestataire, as the French would say. I'm not so sure about examinations becoming as a milestone that should become a pivotal milestone. I'm more interested in a more pluralistic model of assessment, but I don't know what your views are. I mean, I'd go to Anna and to Gabby.
Yeah. Well,
you could say yes, examinations. I would say that, wouldn't I? I'm actually quoting another person called Davis, but that doesn't mean that I'm against different assessment models.
Formative assessment.
Formative assessment is extremely important, of course, in the context of class and the relationship between the tutor and the adult, or the teacher and the pupil. It's the teacher who's the one who's able to give positive feedback to the pupil in order for them to make progress. I don't deny that at all. It's extremely important. But from our experience working in the field, we have had plans in order to be able to record smaller units, those smaller steps, if you wish, along the journey. So there have been more than one effort, actually, to try and capture those formative assessment steps for the learners, and they haven't been successful. They have succeeded to an extent. We have found that an examination, not necessarily for those who choose to sit an examination, but I think this comes back to a question that was brought up by someone else. Do you need a piece of paper to show that you're able to speak a language? No, you don't. Is the simple answer. No, you don't have to have a certificate to prove that you're able to speak Welsh or any other language. In the majority of contexts, no, you don't. But there are contexts where an employer will need to see evidence of your skills, and that evidence has to be valid and dependable in order to have value in the skills that you have. You may not like what I'm going to say next. We have begun an initial discussion to include Welsh as one of the languages, or as another language apart from English, for those people who move into the UK to be able to settle in the UK in order for them to gain citizenship or to have permanent citizenship, because English is the only language that's currently accepted. Welsh is not there. You have to sit a test with regards to society, and there was somebody actually in the press recently who sat that test through the medium of Welsh. I think someone from Cardiff University had sat the Life in the UK test through the medium of Welsh. Well, what about the Welsh language? We should give the same status to the Welsh language. There's only been one initial meeting, but hopefully it will be possible to include the Welsh language within that same list of qualifications, if you wish, the same standard as English. That's a very specific context, I know. And of course, you don't need a piece of paper or certificate to prove that you are able to speak Welsh in the majority of contexts, whether that be socially or not. But I would argue in favour of the value of having formative assessment as well as continual formative assessment. The two need to go hand in hand. And I think that takes me to Miririd's question. What comes first, the examination or the course? And I would say neither, but I would say that you have to analyse the needs of the audience, the learners, the candidates. That should come first. And then there's a need to construct something that's as a basis for an examination and the resources, and everything then derives from that model. I'm not familiar with the new Welsh curriculum, but it's good to see that there is a full educational model here, and that people such as yourselves are putting those principles to work, and that's good to see. So sorry, I have gone on a bit of a tangent there. Sorry.
No, not at all. That was really, really important. And I want to again, and I think with those comments in mind about the complexity, I wanted to ask Anna and Gabby to again talk about the link between, as you quite rightly said, Emma, between the learner needs, the learning that takes place, and then the assessment. I'd be very keen to get Anna and Gabby's views. So maybe if you could begin, Gabby, what would your views be on how interrelations that they're at work there? Gabby, you're on mute at the moment. You're on mute.
Sorry. There are some quite important interrelations here, as we all know. I think one of them that we have to consider as well is that it is about the status we give a subject in school, if that's what it is. Because if a subject is not assessed, or in education or society more widely, if a subject is not assessed, it may mean or may send the signal that it is not so important. And I think this is sometimes the problem with languages, that it is seen as an enrichment subject rather than, in Wales, maybe a little less than in England, to be honest. But that we say, okay, we have a playful way, and then everybody gets really excited and interested, and then they will want to take exams. I think it doesn't quite work like that, because if students are also busy like us, they have to set priorities, and then they will study maths. And they will not spend much time learning languages. And as we have heard, or we all know, learning a language is not easy. It needs grit, it needs effort, it needs time, it needs investment. And if we haven't got a clear structure of recognition, so it's a balance of keeping the interest going, forcing people or not forcing people, but also recognizing effort where it is expended. I think one thing we may have to think about is, what is it we're actually assessing? Is it sort of a body of vocabulary, a corpus, or is it language strategies as well? Is it that I can mediate between languages, that I can mediate between people who are saying different things? Because this is where the actual value of language in a society is, isn't it? And there, I think the CFR, the new companion volume, is very useful. That was issued in 2018. That also values not measures, but has an assessment grid for mediation skills. And I think this is also something that is a way forward. I think I'll leave it here. To leave some time for Anna, Vivian.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think Anna and I, we've discussed precisely mediation. So, I mean,
absolutely.
So I'll let Anna hopefully intervene here.
Yes, about the relationship then between learning and assessing learning. You know, we have been reassured by Welsh Government that it will be the learning driving the assessing rather than the other way round. We all know what the effects of the assessments driving the learning have been on language learning in Wales. It's been detrimental and has continued to decline. The numbers who are selecting to study a modern language for a qualification has declined in Wales. I appreciate that there are other reasons for this, but the idea of examining and assessing a learner's achievement on one specific day in an exam hasn't been productive. We know what the implications are for learners' well-being and the impact that it has on their confidence in language learning. I think that the only purpose of assessments, in a way, is to show where learners are on the continuum and what they need to do next. So they're pointers to further learning rather than an end point. And we know that the qualifications in Wales have not led to lifetime language learning or to further use of the language in the future. And so I do think that we need to contextualize learning, and that the assessments also have to be contextualized so that the purpose of language learning and its uses are clear to learners. And we've had discussions in the past, Claire, haven't we, about maybe an alternative qualification which recognises language learning as a skill, which isn't an end to itself, but an accompaniment to other future pathways and careers.
Yes, and just to pick up on that, colleagues, I think as we move towards the end of the session, there's a question from our colleague Nia Jones here, and she picks up, I think, the very good point here that there have been very great enthusiasm from teachers around learners having additional, activities, but she's not sure, and I quote here, whether all language teachers have the necessary skills themselves to be able to work with and develop multilinguistic awareness. So I do wonder whether we want to comment here on the role for maybe professional development for our teachers to be able to deliver what we're talking about, which is quite a reconfiguration, as Anna, as you presented it, of a language journey, not only of a young person, but of the teacher as well. And again, Gabby, you brought out your own language journey. You gave us a very good sense of your own multilingual self. I wonder how we can help, and whether there are ways and means to help our teacher communities also rethink some of the ways that they've previously and will wish in the future to interact with their classroom. I don't know if you want to maybe come in here first, Anna, as somebody close to the ground on this one.
Yes, I understand that concern, and I noticed also in the same comment it mentioned that maybe teachers of international languages would be best equipped to deal with this in schools. However, the curriculum for Wales specifies clearly that it is the responsible of the whole area and teachers across the whole area. The implications for professional learning are substantial, and that is something that will have to be addressed in the next 5 terms.
And do you want to come in here, Gabby, again here, just a bit around, just maybe to end with a view on the role of the teacher in the discussions that we're having?
Yes, I think it's a very important as well. And I think, Anna, Vivian, you mentioned the language journey. And I think as a teacher, it only occurred to me later on in my career that I should share my own language learning journey with my students and present myself as a role model of a language learner rather than a language expert in one specific language. this kind of mindset of what a teacher is and what they know also would empower all those who have learned an additional language. Like I was teaching Spanish, this was not my first language. But then I said, okay, if we don't know this word, I don't know it either. What do we do? I can help you find out, and so we can learn together. And I think this is this move from a transmission model to a co-learning model of learning or of education, really, just as a
Thank you, Gabby. And maybe, Emma, would you like to have a final word for us in the last minute or so about the role of the teacher in the context in which you work? And then I'll wrap up very briefly at the end.
Yes, thank you, Claire. Yes, the role of the tutor is extremely important. And the National Centre for Teaching Welsh are doing an important piece of work in this field, nurturing and developing new tutors and providing training and qualifications for tutors who are beginning to teach Welsh. But I am concerned about one thing. This move to teaching on Zoom because of the pandemic has meant that we have lost a quarter of our workforce. So it will be a problem in finding new tutors. But you are quite right. The role of the tutor is an extremely important one. So I agree with the other speakers on that point, at least. And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to take part, and to thank you for the opportunity to take part through the medium of Welsh as well. I think that conveys an important message that it is possible to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Emyr. Diolch, da iawn. Thank you to Gabby and to Anna for coming in as our roving panelists. And can I thank you all for the warm community of linguists that are here, our colleagues, obviously, who are delegates as well. This is about sharing, creating together and working together for the benefit of all our young and our adult learners in Wales of languages. And I think, the model of Zoom, although it's challenging, is that we can all be together and there should not be any silo learning around any language. We should all be linguistic proselytizers, because as we've seen this morning, the more that we learn, the more that we're exposed to languages, the better that is for our well-being in so many different spheres. So merci bien tout le monde d'être venu. Thank you for coming, for everybody, and we welcome you into our further sessions. I thank very much to Gabby, Emyr, to Anna, and to Tess for their wonderful contributions and for their rich discussion around such a warm and encouraging area as motivating language learning of the future. Thank you. Goodbye.